But our next speaker is Dr. Dewey Caron, and he'll be talking about continuing losses of Washington beekeepers, a 10-year survey of backyarders. Dr. Dewey Caron, University of Delaware and Oregon State University. And I don't know if Dewey remembers it, but he was the editor on the very first paper I ever published, and it was quite an ordeal. But maybe we'll talk about that over a beer sometime. Okay, Dewey, take it away.
All righty, thank you, thank you, Steve. But it made it much sharper paper, and that same thing happened to me with my first paper. It's humbling, believe me. All righty, we're going to talk about a survey activity, and this is relative to, as indicated, since I moved from the East Coast with retirement from the University of Delaware, I have started survey work here on the West Coast. Some of this data will be in conjunction with OSU and Ramesh Sagili for some of the commercial beekeeper data that we have. Continuing losses of the Washington beekeepers. Thank you for joining. Be glad to try to answer questions that you might have. I'll start with this past annual survey. Now, there are two national, there's a national survey, and this I'm talking about is a Pacific Northwest survey. For the states of Oregon and Washington, we do a backyarder survey. And for the three states of Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, we do a commercial beekeeper survey. They are separate surveys. So this is showing the results for this past overwintering period for the results for Washington beekeepers. Actually, this is showing the data for both Oregon and Washington. And as indicated, this shows by some of the county associations and then by state. So this number here next to Lewis County indicates 32 as the number of respondents to the past survey, and the bar length here indicates the loss. Well, you can see overall for Washington State, this is a 50% overwintering loss. And for this past winter from the survey, a 38% overwintering loss from Oregon. And this has been traditionally the case in both states. The loss in Washington has been heavier than in Oregon. For each of those that have more than 19 respondents this past year, there is an individual report. So there's an individual report for just the Lewis County, as well as an overall report for Washington State. And for some reason, I'm not getting advance here. There we go. So I've just highlighted the Washington State overall report. The question is asked by a number of ways, but the one that we base our statistics on is the loss by hive type. And so we're asking for individuals that have 8-frame Langstroths, number of colonies they had in the fall, number in the spring. From that, then we did compute the 30% overwinter loss for 8-frame colonies. For Langstroth, 10 frames. The N here is 133 Washington State beekeepers. Of the only 4 wary hives, all of them lost, so that bar looks unusual, but it's only 4 colonies. The data would seem to indicate that Langstroth 8s are better than Langstroth 10s, at least this past year. However, when we look at this data over a number of years, that is not significant. They are about the same for losses, although this year that is statistically significant. Nukes are always, as you might expect, a higher, heavier loss. The other hives, depending on the club, overall account for, as you can see, 21 out of 133 colonies. 133 individuals. This would be 21 colonies out of that total number. Represents about 5% of colony numbers that the N of 133 turned in. And a couple of clubs that's a little bit higher, but it's not a high number. And those losses are a little bit higher. Other is the AZ hives, long hives, observation hives, number of other hive types. Okay. We look also at asking the question by the origination of the hive. So was that an overwintered colony? As you can expect, that level is usually always the lowest. Was it a colony that was established by a package or by a nukes? Those are always higher. Was it a swarm hive, a swarm capture, splits, divides, and then was it a feral hive transfer of only 4 in that particular case, 2 of which survived, so for 50% survival. So these numbers will vary from one year to the next, but looking over several years, they pretty much come out about in the same place, about in the same numbers. And I have done that in the report for Washington State, gone back and looked at the last 6 years where I have good data of what's happened in those past 6 years. Then the information we ask, in terms of number of colonies. So from that, we can compute how many had no loss over the winter period, whatever their colony number would be. This past year, that was 25 individuals out of the N of 133. So 19% had no winter loss. Double that number had 100% winter loss, 41%. And then also how many colonies were lost. That's related to the numbers. Now, this is not just the 8 frame or 10 frame. This is across all the colony types, including nukes. So there are 30 individuals lost a single colony, 35 lost 2 colonies, on out to where 3 individuals lost 20 plus colonies. These numbers for the backyard survey are individuals that have up to 50 colonies. If an individual has more than that, they are then in our other part of the survey, and that would be under the semi-commercial or commercial losses. And so 50 has been a traditional number. I've developed a number of years ago to try to come up with a definition of what's a part-time or a backyarder, what's a sideliner, and what's a commercial beekeeper. So all of this so far has been under 50 colonies, individuals responding that have 50 or fewer colonies. This past year for Washington State, the highest number was actually, I think, 42 or 42, 45. It's usually around that number, but under 50. All right, for the last 6 years of the best numbers that we have, as indicated, this has been 10 years, but the best numbers we're able to tease out from the data are looking at this last 6-year loss record. There's a couple of things on this. First off, this red line represents for the last 6 years the loss of those individuals that had responded to the survey that was the backyarder under 50 colonies. So for example, you see here in 2017, 63% represents the number of loss of backyarder colonies. So that's this red trace that occurs across the top. Below is a blue trace, and the blue trace is the number of commercial, semi-commercial losses of individuals. So for example, back to 2015, that's 22%. This past year, that's 22 also, again, 22%. The numbers that we're talking about in this 6-year period, the backyard numbers are as low as 20%. That's all the way back here in 2015. This past year, 133. So we're talking of anywhere between 20 and 133 individuals. And each year with a report, it's identified. For the commercial respondents, that number has been around 10, fairly consistently all the way back to 2015, 10 individuals for their reporting their loss. The black line through here is a trend line. So a trend line is looking at both years here and averaging them, etc. You can see that unfortunately for the individuals that this survey is capturing in both the backyarders and the commercials, the number is increasing. So in the last 6 years, the amount of overwintering loss has been on an increase, not on a decrease. Okay. Now, that's the PNW survey, and I'll come back to it, but I wanted to show just as a comparison our national survey, since Ramesh and I both are involved as well with the Be Informed Partnership, the BIP National Survey. This initially started as a survey of just winter, so that's what the gray bars are showing here. And initially, going back to our initial year, 2000, 2007, and 8, this was of commercial beekeepers. They were actually sent a questionnaire, and a number of them then were followed up with a phone call. We switched this national survey to an electronic survey beginning in 2010 and 11. And again, we asked the overwintering loss level. So again, this is continuing gray bars. But in addition, we also asked in terms of summer loss, and then the darkest of the color bars here, the orange bar, was annual loss. So this would be summer losses in 2010, 2011, overwintering losses, and then annual losses. Fast forwarding to our past year, the 2019, 2020. So this was the survey done in 2020. We had the second lowest overwinter loss nationally that we found in all of these 13 years of survey activity. The second lowest at 22% overwinter loss. However, we also found last year the second highest annual loss, which is double. So 22% of the colonies of individuals were lost over the winter, but over the whole season, almost 1 in 2 colonies were lost. 44% was the overall loss at level that year. Some of this is attributed to the fact that the year before, the 1819, was not a very favorable year for queen rearing in California, particularly, where many of our queens come from, not all of them, but many. And so this annual loss was thought to be with fairly high queen replacements in this 19. So through the year, not the winter, but through the year, losses in terms related to that rather poor queen rearing year the year before. I will also point out that although last year was a 22% loss, the second lowest, it was followed by the year of the highest level of loss that we've ever had over winter period. Now, again, this is all 50 states that are involved in this national survey. The numbers vary considerably, and this is an account of the losses. And so, although the survey respondents are in any one year anywhere from 92 to 95% backyard beekeepers, this graphic is actually showing the related losses of the commercial beekeepers, because this is loss of numbers of colonies, not loss by individuals. One commercial beekeeper with 20,000 colonies is going to have a level of loss, but it's not, and although the backyarders will have double that level of loss, 200 is still talking about maybe 1,000 or 1,200 colonies. So when you throw those two buckets together, it's the loss that we're looking at by commercial. And this is illustrated well with the Washington numbers. So going back to the Pacific Northwest survey that I've done here, I've added one other item, and so on the green trace here is the Be Informed level of losses by Washington number of Washington beekeepers, and again, these same past 6 years. Now, in that pub number, that has varied from a low of 73, that actually just this past year, 73, and going back, all of our surveys, we've been getting less survey response. So going back in here, we're talking about 158 Washington beekeepers responding to the survey, 73 at this particular point here. The number, by the way, that represents is because of the way the bee-informed numbers are gathered, the number is computed for overall losses, and then numbers are computed for the various 50 states. So this green trace is just the 50 state numbers for Washington. At any one time, however, this represents from a low of 1% to as many as 4% that are in the state of Washington only. And commercial beekeepers that will report that they're in, let's say, California, they're reported that they're doing some of their beekeeping in Oregon and some in Washington state. That number will be in all 3 state reports, but that number is not tripled to give us the overall level itself. So they're counted just one time for an overall level. But if they report that they have time spent in one or several states, that statistic will carry over. So this represents basically the numbers that are of colonies of loss, but you can see that very clearly this represents the level of loss of the commercial beekeepers of the state of Washington, not the level of loss of the backyarders. And as indicated, there is a fairly, except for this 1 year, of distinction, year before last, of the two not crossing. The trend line is this darker of the black line for the commercial, for the bee informed, and you can see that number is equally, the slope is not as strong, but you can see also with this black trace that for the numbers that we are collecting with the bee informed survey, that it is also increasing numbers. Again, as with the commercial, not quite as heavy as that number, and the line, of course, with the backyarders being much heavier than the other two. So when we look at the bee informed, we are basically, in terms of just looking at loss numbers, we are basically looking at the larger number of beekeepers. The beekeepers with larger numbers of colonies, the commercial and the semi-commercial. And for definition, semi-commercial are those individuals with 50 to 500 colonies, commercial more than 500 colonies. There are some other ways of defining semi-commercial. In some cases, you see it up to only 300 colonies, but I'm going back to what USD Department of Agriculture came up with many years ago in terms of trying to define these two terms, commercial and semi-commercial. All right, I need to point out that we are talking about gross losses that occur in any one period of the time, and we're looking at a yearly time period. When we look at the USDA numbers, this is the National Agricultural Statistical Service, NASS agency numbers. They've been estimating numbers of colonies in the U.S. So each of these bars represent the level of estimated colonies in the United States beginning in 1939, and the last year with reliable statistics that's shown here is 2017. Now, I've put a couple of boxes around that. The highest numbers of colonies that we've reported in the United States was shortly following World War II, and that's roughly 6 million colonies being maintained by beekeepers in the United States. Following World War II, lots of changes, of course, for the period of time until 1981, when the statistical survey discontinued counting numbers of colonies, estimating the colony numbers. We were losing from that, in that time period, roughly a colony a year in terms of our numbers. 0.9% loss of colony number per year. There were ups and downs, but roughly a colony loss per year. Now, the statistical service was then discontinued. The counting was discontinued for a number of years, and then through a lot of lobbying by beekeepers, et cetera, it was reinstated. And so it came back after about a 5-year period. And you can see the trace at that point. This red line, the top of the bars, is different. The colony numbers were not different. They did not collapse during this period of time. What actually happened was their method of, their algorithms, their method of estimating colony numbers changed in that period of time. So they've felt starting back up again, this was a better estimate of the number of colonies than what they had finished with prior to discontinuing the survey. Well, overall in that year, then the losses since that period of time have been only half the number, about 0.43, about half a colony per year. Looking at just the last few years, and basically I've started to trace here in 2006. 2006 was when we first described a CCD. And I might point out also back here, 1987 is when varroa mites came into the United States. All of these numbers here were pre-varroa mite, pre-tracheal mites. This starting up the survey was in part response to the mites, but is with mites. And since 2006, in this last box, was when we've described the term and used the term CCD. And in that last box, you can see actually for the last years since the 2006 shown here, we've actually been increasing colony numbers. So the annual loss that I've looked at here in the Pacific Northwest, the backyarders and the commercials, is a gross loss. This shows net loss. Yes, we have lost colonies since the high point of shortly after World War II. We only have about half that number presently, but we're not currently losing colonies. So our net losses is not a loss. It has been, but at least for the last 14, 15 years now, closely 15 years, we've actually been having a net gain. And that puts us in the same category of Canada, where the red trace here is showing the colonies in Canada. And then among the worldwide numbers as well, which I brought in at the bottom here, the number of worldwide colonies in the period that is shown here. And the first number is the 60s, has been 50 to 80 million increase in numbers of colonies. So worldwide, Canada, and in the United States, we're annually losing colonies, in some places heavier than others, and we're heavier in the US than, for example, in Canada, and as an example also for Europe, but we are not decreasing in our colony numbers. We are actually gaining in colony numbers. Worldwide, most spectacularly in that level, that number of gain. Okay. All right, I'm going to finish this with looking back just at our Pacific Northwest numbers again. I'm leaving the national and the international scene. In the survey for the Pacific Northwest, and again, this is done also, it mirrors the Be Informed survey. It's done in the month of April. It is of the backyarders. So we're back to just the backyarders, not our commercial beekeepers. We asked the question in terms of those that had losses, what do you think was your level of loss? And I'm sorry, what was your reason? This is showing a reason of loss. And also, what would you say as an acceptable loss level? Individuals could have several reasons why they thought they lost if they had multiple colony losses. So here we're talking of an N of 188, and this is excluding the individuals that had no losses, because they would not have filled out this survey question. You can see by the pie chart that there is no one level reason that sticks out among the others. The weakest, the strongest numbers, and this is consistent one year to the next, is weak in the fall, varroa mites, queen failure, starvation, and then there are a whole bunch of others between yellow jackets and poor wintering losses, etc. So this shows this past year. The numbers vary a little bit from one year to the next, but not greatly. Now, there's no one verifying that this county that a person reports as weak in the fall died from being weak in the fall, or this one reported to die from varroa mites. 40 individuals making that selection, that actually it died from varroa mites. So this is a self-report. Acceptable losses is the same. This is a question where we're asking individuals, irrespective of the loss that you had, what do we feel would be an acceptable loss? We're letting individuals define the term acceptable, and that's going to vary. So you can see that there are individuals that will select that they 5%, 10%. The median for this past year was 20%. And I'll point out that individuals, 12% of the respondents reported either 50, 75, or 100% of loss was an acceptable level of loss to them. Very frequently, the none is a very high number here of losses as well, but it doesn't quite. It's a little bit different from the number before, which I showed was 15 individuals that said they had none as a loss. So sometimes these don't always match up exactly. They're usually very close. So in the survey for the Pacific Northwest, as we do with the National Bee Informed Survey, we also ask questions about management. And so our interest in terms of management is related to those factors that might help flatten our mite curve. This illustration that we developed for our Bee Informed indicates that we're managing populations of bees, so that from a very low point coming out of winter and through a population increase to a population peak, we're managing our population of bees, and right now, of course, we're managing them during a population decrease. In terms of our mite control, we're also need to be concerned about the same thing. Their bell-shaped curve, a point where they reach their highest population, is different from where our bees reach their highest population. And so for our interest in our mites, this is our period of August, September, October, where they reach their population peak. Where our bees we're talking about over on the west side of the state here of Oregon and Washington, we're talking about blackberries. It could be, it does vary a bit from one part to another. So our questions related to management are related to issues that might be done to help reduce those overwinter losses, to reduce the losses that they'll see during the year as well, okay? So our questions on management begin with management for feeding. The weakness of this particular assay is that I am comparing a single management factor to loss. So then I will ask the question, for example, on the survey, the question is asked, what did you do in terms of feeding? And this past year, out of 133 individuals, 3 individuals said they did no feeding, none whatsoever. And then then I looked at those 3 individuals, their individual loss of just those 3 individuals, and they had a 50% loss. And I'll point out that that compares this past year to overall loss level. So that if those individuals did nothing, they had the same level of loss that others did had as average, the overall average loss for all the Washington beekeepers, the 133 individuals. Of more interest, however, is for those that do some management, are they finding that they're having a lower level of loss? Here are some, is one of our interesting ones to point out in terms of feeding. Those that feed protein in some form, in this particular year, frames of pollen, 4 individuals did that. They reported an 18% loss, just those 4 individuals. Those that fed dry pollen, 3 times the number did that. 12 individuals, they had a 24% level of loss. In other words, they had half the loss, those 12 individuals had half the loss of the entire database. The entire database, 133, had the 50% loss. Another one of interest is those that fed sugar in some form other than as a syrup. So those that fed hard sugar, a candy sugar, 33 individuals said they did that and reported a 42% level of loss. Fondant sugar, 36% level of loss. Dry sugar, also a 42% level of loss. That would compare with 98 individuals out of 133 that said they fed sugar syrup, having essentially the same, well, you know, statistically certainly the same number of level of loss as overall level of loss had as well. Those that fed liquid honey, you can see, again, comparable to some of the dry sugars. This is indicating that there are some managements that may make a difference. And again, the weakness here is I'm just comparing this one management. We don't often do one thing in a vacuum. So during the active year or preparation for fall, we may have fed a sugar syrup, so we ticked that one. And then over the winter, we may have fed fondant sugar, so we ticked that one. I'm not trying, this analysis does not compare doing both of those things. It's comparing just doing the one factor. And in fact, many people will do more than one aspect, particularly with this management with feeding. Likewise, with this one for wintering, let's go back here. For some reason, that one is not falling in. There we go. Winter manager and winterizing. And the case with winterizing, in the report, I do talk about several years, but this is only the 1 year. Last year, out of 133 individuals, 11 individuals said they did nothing in terms of preparation of their colonies for winter. They had a 74% loss compared to the overall database with 50. So they had, again, a quarter more levels of loss than did everyone else. So it's a very conservative look at in terms of how this would work out, because these 11 individuals are in among the 133 individuals in the overall database. For winterizing, some of the ones to look at, equalizing colony strength was one of the factors. In some cases, that means just strengthening the weak colonies, combining colonies, whatever. But in the case of commercial beekeepers, all the time they're equalizing. Our backyard are not doing it as frequently, but it seems like that is of a beneficial type of management to improve winterizing losses. 25% loss, in other words, half the level of losses. Others wrapped, insulated the top. Most of the heat loss is lost through the top. An upper entrance access. All 3 of those having lower levels of loss as a winterizing activity. That would seem that those that are doing those seem to improve on overall losses. And I'll point out again that sometimes some individuals will have upper entrance, insulation at the top, also some insulation wrapped around the entire colony. So they may be doing all 3. But this comparison is just those 40 individuals, 30 individuals that said they wrapped insulated for winter and their loss alone. Sanitizing and screen bottom boards, there's questions on both of those. So far, they don't make a difference in terms of improving winterizing. Were a lot of good reasons why we might want to do better job in terms of our sanitization, in terms of our colony handling. Here we're cleaning the hive tool perhaps from one apiary to the next or one colony to the next. Screen bottom boards as well, and of course we've had the support research studies on screen bottom boards to indicate that they're not really very effective in knocking mite numbers down. So, and it was not surprising that among our Washington beekeepers, it didn't seem to make much of a difference if you use the screen bottom board. What does make a bit of a difference on screen bottom boards, not shown here, is that if you close or partially close that entrance during the winter, those individuals that do have a screen bottom board and close it over the winter do enjoy a better wintering success. On to monitoring. Monitoring is both pre and post monitoring. Pre meaning to use a monitoring technique of whatever I've listed. There are the 5 major ways in which this is done by beekeepers are shown here. And post would be after you've done a control, did you then check and see if it was effective, if it did what you thought it would do. I'll point out this is the last year, 2020, for the individuals from Washington, 133 that responded. This shows the level that said they were using sticky board. This is the alcohol wash. That number is 11% indicated they were doing an alcohol wash. 22%, double the number, said they used powdered sugar. And then nearly half, 42%, said their method of monitoring was looking on drone brood and or visual inspection. The numbers came out the same in terms of looking for the mites on the body of the adult bee, or in this case, looking on cells of brood, of drone brood. And these numbers add up to more than 100 because, again, we often don't resort to one method of trying to do our monitoring. So this is multiple answers were, multiple checks are possible on the survey form, and so that's what has been registered, these multiple responses. We've had a lot of the fantastic information that Randy is generating in terms of effectiveness, in terms of looking at powdered sugar roll and alcohol wash, and the ways that we might improve how we do it to improve our success. Looking back at these numbers of what was done last year, I've circled the 2 here, the visual methods, drone brood and looking on adults. And I want to remind all that Sam Ramsey has looked at actually where he finds mites on the adult bees. This is just the adult bees, not the brood. And he has come up with numbers that on the left side of the adult, on the abdomen portion, he finds about 60% of the mites that he finds on adult bees. If you turn them over to the right side, he finds another 21% on the right side of the adult bee. But when he looks from above and is looking at the thorax, the top of the abdomen, he's finding less than 5% of the total mites that he finds on adult bees. I use perhaps as an example here in bringing in this question, if you were going to look at a human population, let's say people standing in line to boat coming up, how would you sample those people standing in line as to whether they had tattoos? All right, so that's what we're saying with a visual inspection of the adults. How do we look at those adults to see if they have mites? Just looking at the top, or just looking at individuals that have clothing on, standing in line to vote, would we get a fair assessment of the number of human individuals that have tattoos? Or if we're looking at our bees, we're not picking them up by the wings, as I think Randy had a shot of that earlier, and looking on particularly the left side of the abdomen, look how many we would be missing, or the other fraction, look how few that we would actually be seeing, less than 5%, because we're looking at this part of the bee. We're not picking them up by the wings and looking for where they actually do occur on adults. When I see numbers that are, 42% are saying that's their method of monitoring, I think we've got some room for improvement to try to be more effective in monitoring. And finally, we ask questions specifically to mite control. There are several, but here are the last two that we're going to discuss. The whole report is available on this same website. I've been listing at each of the pages, pnwhoneybeesurvey.com. So I asked the question of how many individuals use a non-chemical mite control, yes or no. So no is 17%, say they do not, in this past year, did not use a non-chemical. Now, same question for chemical control. In this past year, you can see 26.5% said they did not use any chemical control. And of course, then we ask what control did you use? So this represents the non-chemical control. Here's our overall population, 50% level of loss by the 133 individuals. And you can see there's nothing that really sticks out. The 6 individuals that said they used something in terms of hygienic queens, yes, half the level of losses. But none of these others really are very different. Distinctive colors, drone brood removal, a little bit, but when we look at numbers, 30 out of 133, 39% to 50%, depends on our variation if that's statistically significant or not. Where we do see the real difference is those individuals using non-chemical, using a chemical control. Here's our 50% line, that is of the population. Colonies lost by the backyarders, half of their colonies, 50%. When we start looking at different products, the 7 individuals that used Apagard, the thyme oil product, 22% level of loss. Apivar, 32% level of loss. Oxalic drizzle, 43% level of loss. Vaporization, 51 individuals, 39% level of loss. The 2 that used the shop towel method of one form or another, there are variations. The 2 individuals had no loss. So this again is looking over the beekeepers' fence, asking a lot of beekeepers, 133 throughout the state of Washington, what did you do? Those 7 individuals that said they had Apagard, I looked at their level of loss, and they had a level of loss that was less than half of the level of loss of all the rest of us individuals that were seeking to manage our colony in one form or another. So I encourage you to if you are in the clubs from basically the I-FI clubs on up to Tacoma, there are individual reports and an overall Washington report.
Hey, thank you